think it's a matter of what your values are, whether or not you want to make the Mutual building into a parking lot or a play space or a daycare center.
Lucille Olson wants the business and government leaders in Minneapolis to start planning now for the future child care needs of the city's working parents. In this half hour, the struggle to find affordable quality daycare in America, the social changes caused by the growth in the number of working mothers, and what a national comprehensive child care policy would mean for parents. These children are lucky. They have a new daycare facility right next door to where their parents work on Capitol Hill. There are plenty of trained supervisors and lots of activities. While this center, created by parents who work for U.S. senators, is striving to be a model child care cooperative, it is certainly not the norm in this country. The kind of high-quality daycare found here on Capitol Hill is simply not available to millions of children. In part, that is because the demand has increased so rapidly. Today, more than half of all mothers with preschool children are working. As a result, many parents are forced to take whatever unlicensed, unsupervised help they can find. In some cases, children are even left alone for part of the day. In Minneapolis, the daycare need has become so critical that a group of AFSCME locals have asked the government and private employers for help. They want space set aside in downtown buildings for on-site daycare. We'll watch Lucille Olson as she fights to convince a citywide task force to plan for these centers. We'll also look at how daycare has become a national problem as millions of mothers go back to work after having children. And we'll examine whether the federal government should be providing more dollars, more regulation, and more leadership in this area. First, to Minneapolis and Lucille Olson.
There are a lot of women who recently had children and who are coming back, and they all seem to have a lot of problems finding someone to care for their children, and also in anxiety about how their children are. You know, it seems to be so common now.
Hi, how you doing?
Lucille Olson understands the anxiety parents feel trying to find child care. She returned to work when the youngest of her 5 children was age 2.
Thank you for holding. You were asking.
As a senior social worker for Hennepin County, Minnesota, she's used to dealing with her clients' problems. As an officer of her union, she's now working on the concerns of her co-workers.
So, Cyril, how long have you been back at work now?
Well, I've been back. This will be my 4th week now.
You've been back at work for 4 weeks?
for 4 weeks.
How old is your baby?
Okay, Seamus is now, let's see, 18 weeks old.
18 weeks
18
old?
weeks, and Brendan, the older one, he's a little bit over 4 years old, so it's kind of a lot of work.
What does it cost you each day you work?
Okay, well, for Seamus, it's $20 a day. And if I had gone to a commercial place, it would have been around $27 a day.
Mm-hmm. For infant care? Mm-hmm. In addition to the $13 a day?
So right now, I mean, it's...
So what's left of your salary?
Right, it takes about, I'd say, pretty close to almost 60%.
What would happen if you waited till Seamus was older? Did you have any choice?
Well, we needed the income, and the county provides really only about 6 weeks unpaid maternity leave. And after that, I was kind of concerned because I wanted to have my same job back and everything, so I just decided I'd come back then.
I almost didn't return to work because I couldn't find adequate daycare, and I looked at over 75 situations before I found something. I wonder how many other women are facing those same kinds of issues. I mean,
well, apparently more than each of us know about. Yes, I think more than each of us know about, because Cyril Kennedy took her 10 months to find a family daycare for her infant.
I know mine, right before I started work, my first plan fell through, and I was in a complete and total panic that just a few days before I was going to start back, and how could I come to work if I didn't have any place? Mm-hmm. And I called over 40 places.
Good morning!
The problems of finding adequate care, as well as the difficulties in transporting children before and after work, led a group of AFSCME locals to sponsor a citywide forum on child care. One result was the creation of a task force to determine the feasibility of a downtown daycare center near parents' workplaces. As a member of the task force, along with business leaders and county officials, Lucille updates local union leaders who are meeting to set priorities for contract negotiations.
Right now, they see their charge as is it possible, is there interest in it? Would there be customers for an on-site daycare center? How would it be funded, and what kind of options would there be for funding? Is there a safe spot in the downtown area?
What are your folks saying about daycare? What are they telling you they want in the contract to meet daycare needs? Is it a big issue out there?
Our folks would prefer to have on-site daycare when their children are small, meaning not in school yet.
One of the major issues to the clerical employees was the cost of on-site daycare, the fees. And they were very concerned that they would be, that the fees would be affordable.
We have folks in our unit that are on job share status that would prefer to be working full-time solely because of childcare. And they'd very much like to have childcare on site or near site.
I'd just like to make the point, we also are concerned with issues of justice. And I think what we have here is an issue of justice and social justice. And if it doesn't affect a preponderance of people, it's like a school bond issue. Not everyone has kids who go to school, but society is served by children being educated.
A survey of downtown buildings for space to house a daycare center produced some discouraging news at the next task force meeting.
Well, to be brief about it, the city of Minneapolis has no space. The only site that really would be a possibility would be the City Hall building itself. And that building would be subject to many of the constraints or many of the costs for adapting it to child care.
Lucille.
So I found that the county's property management report was full of editorial comments. Instead of just giving the space that the county owned and the square footage, they said this will be an unreasonable cost. That's a public policy decision. They seem to be predisposed towards thinking that there's nothing available, or they don't want to make anything available, or it's not a good idea to make anything available.
All we're asked to do is to bring this information back to those policymakers, and we're not being called upon to make those policy decisions.
I think it's a matter of what your values are, whether or not you want to make the Mutual building into a parking lot or a play space or a daycare center.
In the case of the Mutual building, the policy decision was to replace it with a parking lot. When she learned of county plans to put up a 10-story parking garage, Lucille confronted a county commissioner about priorities.
Also, the latest edition of the Hennepin County Newsline had a story that they were putting up a $15 million building on the site of the old General Hospital. It's going to have 1,200 parking spaces. So here you have a brand new building. Construction is starting in September. There are a lot of potential there, and that wasn't even mentioned.
If you want me to comment on it, I will, but I don't know if you want to put on-site childcare in a parking lot, number one. Number two, the bonds were $11.5 million worth of bonds were approved by the legislature for our sale, and that bond authorization included no provision at all for anything other than parking. In addition to that, the design, the bid specifications and the design for the parking facility have been approved, and so just because the actual construction hasn't started doesn't mean the project isn't quite a long way into its development.
There are choices and options, that it's not like a physical law that there's no space available, but choices are made about how space is going to be used.
But again, it would be very difficult for me to go back to the county board and propose, for instance, putting on-site childcare there or green space there if it was going to be for some sort of long-term use.
There's no space that has been planned for daycare, but it's conceivable that you could plan for it. And that's the point I'm trying to make. The objection I had to the report from property management, it made it seem like no forever. It's totally impossible. But if you think about it, and if you have it in your thoughts when you're planning space, it can be done.
In some areas, state and local governments as employers are responding to daycare needs, usually as a result of the kind of pressure Lucille Olson is putting on the city of Minneapolis. AFSCME locals in New York State have succeeded in establishing 18 government-funded daycare centers for the children of state employees. But what about private sector employers? What are they doing? On a statistical basis, the answer is not much. Out of some 6 million businesses in the United States, only about 1,000 have programs to help their workers deal with daycare. To find out why more is not being done, we talked with Dr. Dana Friedman of the Work and Family Information Center of the Conference Board, a business-supported research center.
The difficulty is that the system of childcare is sorely inadequate, so that a lot of employers maybe don't want to start a daycare center or build their own services, but rather want to help their employees buy into the existing system of childcare. So now that they're educated about daycare, they understand the need for it, and they see there's a whole range of solutions. They go to help their employees buy into the childcare system. There's not enough of it out there, or what's out there is not of high quality, so that they're inhibited from providing the kind of solution that they'd like to. The vast majority of working parents are not benefiting right now from employer-supported childcare. And even where more employers may become involved, you're still going to have a lot of employers not in a position to afford new benefits and services. Many employees, in fact 50% of the American workforce, working for companies which are very small, who also can't afford these benefits and services, and a lot of people looking for work who aren't employed and don't have employers who can help them out in this regard. So there's still a substantial portion of working parents or those seeking work who need child care assistance, who are not in a position to benefit from employer-supported child care.
Daycare for American children has been getting headlines recently because of problems of alleged sexual abuse in some cities. But pressure for more regulation and more facilities has been building in recent years because of the changes in the American workforce and the American family. For years, the image of the typical American family was taken from those television families of the 50s and 60s, the Nelsons and the Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, or the Andersons and Father Knows Best. The father went off to work and the mother stayed home and took care of the kids. Today, less than 10% of American families fit that stereotype, primarily because the influx of women with children into the workforce has been truly remarkable. In 1960, less than 3 out of 10 mothers worked outside of the home. Today, 6 out of 10 mothers do. The single fastest growing segment of our labor force is mothers with preschool children. 56% now have jobs. Another 26% would seek employment if affordable child care were available, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. For the vast majority of these women, working is an economic necessity. 2/3 of today's working mothers are either the sole provider for the family or their husbands make less than $15,000 a year. Currently, daycare for one child costs, on average, between $1,200 and $5,000 a year. Thus, many working mothers have to spend 25% or more of their earnings for that service alone. What happens to the children of working mothers? Who cares for them? There are no precise statistics. Most preschoolers are cared for by a neighbor who runs, in effect, a small, unlicensed daycare business in her home. Some are in nonprofit centers, provided by churches or public agencies. The rest are placed in commercial centers such as Childcare or Children's World Incorporated. Arrangements for school children vary even more. Often, a neighbor or an older brother or sister keeps an eye on the child after school. Many children are simply left on their own, even some preschoolers. One expert estimates that 1 in 6 children under 13 now goes without care during significant portions of the day. There are about 7 million of these latchkey children. For those children who are supervised, do they get the care they need? We simply don't know. Even in the states which have tough regulations and licensing, 2/3 of the daycare goes on unregulated, unlicensed, and unseen. One thing we do know, the child care needs in America will only grow. Today, of 49 million women in our workforce, 40% are already mothers. 80% are of childbearing age, and 93% of those are expected to become pregnant during their working lives. With 2 out of every 3 new entrants into the job market expected to be women, in just a few years, we will have almost 30 million children under 13 whose mothers work. The federal government currently has 2 main child care programs. Under one, it gives some financial assistance to providers who serve low-income families. Under the other, it provides parents with a tax credit of up to $1,440 a year for child care costs. The tax credit, which comes to about $1.7 billion per year, is the major federal child care program. But are these 2 programs meeting the national need? With me to try to answer that question are Senator Christopher Dodd, a member of the Senate Labor and Human Resources Committee and co-chairman of the Senate Children's Caucus. Joanne Gasper is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Social Services Policy, the office in the Department of Health and Human Services responsible for developing federal child care policy. Judy Mann is a columnist for the Washington Post who has been covering family issues, including daycare. First, the Children's Defense Fund estimates that as many as 7 million children are left alone sometime during the day. What do we need to do about this, Senator Dodd?
Well, first of all, that number even may be low. The estimates run between 5 and 15 million of latchkey children every day, and obviously that's a staggering statistic. Many of them, by the way, are under 6 years of age. We're not talking about 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds. We're talking about infants that are home alone. And I realize we're talking about budget crunches, and it's hard, and certainly there are a lot of things that different people can do. But to suggest, as some have, that this is really something the federal government ought to have a minimum amount of involvement in, I think is a mistake, and we're going to be paying for it dearly in time to come.
On the question of how many children are left unattended, we do not have good numbers on that. Clearly, where you have an infant or a very young child left unattended, there is grave danger, and there is real concern for what do we do, how do services get to those working parents. One must also, I think, remember that federal support to child care has increased by 60% during the Reagan administration. We have $1 billion that we're presently spending in Head Start alone to serve 443,000 children. We have our employer-supported child care initiative, which is increasing the supply of local child care to working parents. We have our feeding program, as well as you mentioned our tax credit, which we have expanded.
It's somewhat misleading to suggest that this administration has actually increased funding in this area, because I've been there and fought the battles with them. I mean, I can tell you chapter and verse of where I've had to stand there and toe-to-toe and battle for nickels with programs and lose most of them. The actual overall child care support from this administration has been a reduction of almost 15% in the last 4 years, hardly an increase. I can tell you just on sexual abuse issues alone, before we had the news and the notoriety associated with it, administration zero-based it.
You're using the term funding. We're talking about support. And so we're talking about a lot of other things than just the 2 programs which were mentioned earlier in the program. We have not taken away funding for protective services for children. In fact, there has been a substantial increase in funding in those areas. So we are not backing off.
Right. What you're saying, Mrs. Gasper, is that the federal government is doing all that it should do to help in this daycare problem. Is that correct?
We are giving support to child care, and after all, remember that
you're saying this is enough?
I think that we're presently doing enough.
I would say nobody's doing enough. Employers aren't doing enough. The government isn't doing enough. The states and the local communities aren't doing enough. We have this nice notion in this country. We run around saying our children are our future, and yet we're not doing very much to really help them. And we're not addressing all the different dimensions of it. For example, I had a woman come into my office who works at the Post, came into my office the other day. She had a 6-month-old son. Her child care arrangement had broken down that morning. Her husband stayed home that particular day from his work, and she came in desperately trying to find out where she was going to put her child the next day. Now, when you have that, certainly the Post suffered because she's not paying any attention to her work that day. Her child is suffering. Her marriage is suffering. And, you know, that to me is a very vivid example of the fact that we have not addressed the various dimensions of this problem.
We've seen a tremendous increase in the receptivity, if you will, of employers to help support their working parents through information referral, through vouchers, through on-site daycare, through off-site daycare, all sorts of mechanisms. We see an increase in cooperatives, preschools, and daycare centers. We also see a growth in family daycare and satellite daycare. So there is a lot that's happening, and I think there's a tremendous forward momentum. But you're very right, there is not a simple solution.
Well, nowhere near enough. There are some 6 million employers in the United States, and roughly, I think, 1,000 of them are involved today in daycare. And I don't expect them to do that much. I'd like to see them do things, but if we place a lot of our hopes, or a substantial amount of our hopes, on the employers assuming the responsibility, we saw a few years ago, and we assumed that the business sector was going to pick up the slack for taking care of those who were less advantaged in our society, or even charitable contributions. And although there's been some increases, nowhere near the amount necessary as a result of commensurate reductions in federal support for some of these programs. And to assume that the private sector is going to take on the responsibility of daycare, I think that's a myth.
We're the only industrialized nation that doesn't have any kind of a federal comprehensive child care policy. And, you know, I don't see anything like that coming out of the administration. I don't see anything like that coming out of the Democratic Party either.
The Democratic platform is a significant section on child care, a significant section on the federal government.
Does it call for a comprehensive child care policy?
Absolutely.
Why does the government resist a national policy?
We can't do the job right.
Why can't you do the job
There
right?
is no way that we can set federal standards and regulations that work uniformly and comprehensively across the country. We believe that it is much better to regulate child care at a local and state level, where you can go in and you can make the regulations sensitive to the needs in that particular locality.
But even something as simple and as minor as giving some seed money for local community organizations to set up child care centers in the, you know, in the after-school kind of thing, the administration isn't supporting that. And we know for a fact those things work.
Even that level we're getting fought on.
We are providing funding presently where states, if they want to use it, can use it for those kind of activities. I think there's one issue that we need to lay out on the table also in our discussions, and that is the importance of the parent. And I guess I would say that we need a child care system which is sensitive and responsive to what the parent wants for their children, rather than having a government-driven system. And what we need to do in this country is to see that parents have the range of options available to them, so that they can get the type of child care that they desire for their child. And that changes through the life of the child.
When we talk about comprehensive child care, what are we actually talking about?
When I hear you say comprehensive child care, I see federal standards, federal regulations, and federal control of the child care that is provided to working parents in this country. And I do not think that that will help working parents. I think, in fact, that will hinder working parents, because we will have a very difficult time, as well as we try, to be sensitive to the needs in the locale of working parents.
Why is that?
And restrict the options.
I have the hardest time, accepting that logic. I mean, somehow to suggest, because some of us are advocating that the federal government become more involved financially to support local communities and states and families to be able to deal with some of these problems, if you suggest that, there is the assumption immediately that someone in Washington is going to sit there and shove down parents' throats a bunch of regulations to try and rear their kids. That is such a myth. That is such a misstatement of what the purpose is. And to this idea that somehow we are this monster out there that is going to destroy the American family is being perpetrated and promulgated all across the country. I think it's ridiculous. It's not the purpose at all.
To the extent that you say a program has to fit in this little box, then you are limiting the options which are available to working parents.
Well, how are we limiting the options? We're going to provide federal dollars. They've also got, you mentioned private sector involvement and so forth. I mean, is it violative of us to say, look, we'd like to see that it's quality care?
Judy, you not only write about the problem of daycare, but you are also a working mother. You have children who are 5 years old is one?
5, 8, and 18, and I've been dealing with child care problems for 18 years.
What does comprehensive child care mean to you?
What it means to me is having affordable, quality, convenient care of the type that I want. It doesn't mean government funded, it means just having it available. It means having a sort of national commitment to funding centers, if necessary, for low-income people, to paying child care workers properly. In other words, not paying somebody $3 an hour and expecting them to help raise your child, but give them a good, decent wage. Make this an important kind of job. And I would also think that there would be a great deal of merit in having a larger tax credit because people who are paying for child care are paying anything between $1,000 to $5,000 a year, and to be able to take $480 off your income tax is not really very much help.
Senator Dodd, Mrs. Gasper, Judy Mann, thank you so very much. Our time is up, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now that we have seen what the federal government is doing or should be doing about daycare, let's return to the local scene in Minneapolis. We asked Lucille Olson for her thoughts on where the struggle to get daycare for city employees is headed.
Every parent is responsible for the survival and care and upbringing of their child. But if society ignores that charge as well, then society will suffer the consequences.
One of our most serious social questions has been developing in our own backyard. Who's taking care of the kids? That used to be an easy one to answer. Mom. But today in America, mom is at work. 6 out of 10 mothers who have children of grade school age or younger are working. While other industrialized countries have been developing nationwide daycare systems to aid parents and stimulate the development of youngsters, we've taken a hands-off attitude. It's been left largely to parents to find the providers and to foot the bill, as much as $5,000 a year for high-quality daycare. But the increasing pressure on parents to do what is best for their children is creating a climate for change. They need help. They need more providers for infants, for preschoolers, and for kids after school. They need financial help. Child care is the 4th largest item in the family budget, and they need to know that when they leave their children in a daycare center or private home, they will be well cared for. The issue of child care demands our attention. Within 6 years, as many as 30 million children will watch their mothers go off to work every day. That's all for this edition of America Works. I'm Marie Torre.